Sure, we're going to have it for 1 hour. Thank you very much, Professor Mabubani, for having this, agreeing to have this conversation. Very nice to see you again. It's been a while since I've met you. Last time it was in Davos when I was working for the forum.
That's right.
Yeah, and I remember traveling to Singapore all the time, actually, in Southeast Asia. And I remember even at the time, about 10 years ago, ASEAN was, it was still up and coming, and it was becoming such an important place. And yet, in this day and age, it seems like ASEAN is playing such a big role. And I know you are a big promoter, and you played an intricate role in architecturing that ASEAN. And hopefully that coming years, when we have this very difficult situation, I don't know if it's a difficult situation, but a very complex situation between the United States and China, that you yourself will play a huge role in that space. And I just read your book, Has China Won, as I see on your bookshelf as well. Fascinating.
I hope you can persuade a Korean publisher to publish it in Korean.
And I think the conversation today is very timely because I believe my president just had a conversation with Biden yesterday. And obviously, we do it all the time, but Korea-U.S. alliance is very important. And I think one of the conversations they had is, how are they going to handle, quote unquote, handle China relations? So I think coming days, a lot of people will be very much interested in what you have to say about U.S.-China relations in today's conversation. So let me just start. Reading your book, you seem to be very much in, I don't want to call it defense, but at least you help to make the audience understand why China is acting such a way and how China has done, in fact, a fabulous job over the past 30, 40 years in becoming what it is today, and how U.S. is actually the one who's failing in a lot of senses. It's no longer is a trustworthy superpower that we used to know of. And you've talked about your experience in the UN, how you were coming up with each agreement and the US changed the last minute, and that was a precursor of what US is going to do. But having said that, I remember seeing this Pew research that was done last year, I think it was in October, saying that and the Pew Research did a survey in the 14 countries, and mostly the popularity of China, or from general public in those 14 countries, was decreasing. It wasn't going, the popularity was actually decreasing in dramatic ways. I mean, given the fact that last year the COVID played a big role, but still, as a holistically speaking, the popularity of China was declining. Now, having read your book, Understanding China, don't you think China is still not doing what it can in all its senses to increase their position or popularity, or at least communicating with the rest of the world of what they're doing?
Well, I think, you must, there is a very important statistic you should bear in mind when you talk about China and the world, okay? The subject is China and the world. And in the world, there are 7.3, 7.5 billion people. 12% live in the West. 88% live outside the West. And clearly in the Western countries, the Pew survey is most of the countries covered by the Pew survey are Western countries. And so the West historically, as I explain in my book, both in Has China Won and Has the West Lost It, that we are reaching the end of 200 years of Western domination of world history, where the West could decide and the rest had to accept. Now that historical era is coming to an end now. And so we're seeing the return of Asia, return of China, India, and other Asian countries. So psychologically, it's quite normal for the West to feel uncomfortable with this loss of power. And that reflects the anxiety about China that you see in the West also. And at the same time, if you look at the rest of the world, I mean, if you go to, if you want another piece of data, when China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Mm-hmm. Now, there are 193 countries in the world. They are free to choose as to whether or not to join the Belt and Road Initiative, right?
Right.
93. And of course, some countries don't join. United States doesn't join, Japan doesn't join, Australia doesn't join, India doesn't join. Yeah, quite a few countries haven't joined. But of 193 countries, over 130 countries have joined. Mm. So if more than 2/3 of the countries in the world want to join the Belt and Road Initiative, how do you say that China is becoming more and more unpopular? And I'll tell you, a year from now, right, if you and I are talking,
right,
in February 2022, and in the next 12 months, a lot of poor countries are desperate to get vaccines.
Right.
They will not get vaccines from the United States. They will not get vaccines from Europe. They will get vaccines from China. And then I can tell you, a year from now, when you do the surveys of the 7.5 billion people in the world, the majority will say, thank you, China, for the vaccines.
Okay, well, good point. Actually, I was, to your point, the 14 countries, most of them, except maybe Japan and Korea, mostly was in the Western countries. And I was quite disappointed myself that I hope that maybe they could have included ASEAN countries and maybe would have gotten a different answers or different...
Or African countries.
Or African countries, for sure. But talking about the Belt and Road initiatives, in the beginning, it was also very popular. As you said, a lot of countries did hesitate, but ended up having a lot of members happily joined. But now, after it's been quite a number of years, and Korea was very enthusiastic in the beginning as well. But now, even in Korea, we are starting to seeing a little bit of hesitant of how this Belt and Road initiatives will move forward. And we're contemplating whether we're going to probably continue, but our enthusiasm has gone down tremendously. So today's conversation, obviously, we're talking about how China is playing in the global stage, but we are also, obviously, our Korean audience is very much interested in your opinion, what Korea should be doing in coming days, given our relationship with the United States, as well as our very strong economic ties with China. But how would you say about Korea should be expecting China in the coming years?
Yeah, but I think the first point I would emphasize is that in international relations, never be enthusiastic. Always be realistic.
Right.
And I think Korea has lived next door to China, 2,000 years. I don't know how long.
We say 5,000.
5,000 years. So you have to be very realistic. It is always very uncomfortable living next door to a bigger neighbor. Very uncomfortable. So you have to accept that you will never be comfortable, living next door to a big neighbor. And if you want any evidence of it, ask Mexico. And ask Mexico, is it comfortable living to the United States? Right? I mean, President Trump wants to build a wall against Mexico and wants Mexico to pay for the wall.
That's true.
So, when you live next to a big country, it's uncomfortable. And in the Belt and Road Initiative, I must emphasize that South Korea must make a huge distinction. This is where realism is very important between what the Anglo-Saxon media reports about Belt and Road Initiative, which is all negative, and then the reality, which is much more nuanced. And so, for example, there are academic studies done by Deborah Brottingham, a professor, peer-reviewed study by Chatham House, and I can email you the studies.
Absolutely.
I have them. And you will find that all these stories about dead threat diplomacy are untrue, absolutely untrue. And that actually is the countries themselves that, made mistakes, and China is trying to help them come out of these things. And at the end of the day, again, is completely voluntary, right? And so you take a country like Indonesia. Indonesia had to make a choice between building the Jakarta-Bandung railway, and the Japanese competed and the Chinese competed. And the Chinese won in open competition. And Indonesia is doing more with, Indonesia is a country of 250, 260 million people. Huh? Indonesia is doing more with China in the Belt and Road initiative. So in the case of South Korea, you have a very unique strategic challenge. You have a divided Korean peninsula. And that is your number one strategic priority. And to put it very simply, if China doesn't become part of the solution, China becomes part of the problem. So it is unwise for South Korea to alienate China. You have to live and work with China. You have no choice. And that doesn't mean that you kowtow to China. You must stand up to China from time to time. But nonetheless, you must find ways and means of getting along with China. So I think that will be an eternal challenge. You said you'll live with China for 5,000 years. I guarantee you'll live next door to China for the next 5,000 years.
That is
so
true.
Whatever policy South Korea has towards China should not be like the Americans. Don't think in the next 2 years, 4 years. Think in terms of the next 1,000, 2,000 years. That's the time frame to adopt.
I remember you talked about standing up to China from time to time is also necessary. You mentioned in your book, you mentioned in your book how Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew stand up against China when they were trying to promote the communism in Southeast Asia, and then he single-handedly stopped that movement. I think it also has to do with all the necessary and good things that you talked about China's position in your book. It also talks about living next to China for thousands of years and having well-documented history of Korea or at least this peninsula, the relationship this peninsula had with China. There is this unconsciousness in our DNA. It sort of gives an alarm whenever we see something that is not quite right. And although that Pew Research, going back to that Pew Research, although most of those countries were in Western Hemisphere, 2 countries, Japan and Korea, our sentiment about China was also decreasing quite fast. And we can go back to a lot of details, but just skipping all that, there is a sentiment in Korea that China seems like it's no longer the China that we expected or we've been seeing over the past 20 years, especially after the Xi Jinping. And you mentioned in your book, but, Deng Xiaoping's, and after that, post Deng Xiaoping, we thought that we understand China. But after Xi Jinping, we really do not know what China is going to do with this huge power, and we are all worried about that. Don't you think we should be worried about it?
I think you should always be. I use a very simple analogy. Let's say when we began this conversation, 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, there was a small cat in the room next to me, right? Then I talked to you for 10, 15 minutes and suddenly discovered the cat has become a tiger. I was very comfortable with the cat. I was very uncomfortable with the tiger. And that's a very good analogy because in 1980, in purchasing power parity terms, China's GNP was 10% of the United States. 10% in purchasing power parity terms. That was the time of Deng Xiaoping. But by 2014, 34 years later, China's GNP had become bigger than the United States in purchasing power parity terms. It's gone up 10 times in 34 years. So the cat has become a tiger. So I think it's unrealistic to expect that when the cat becomes a tiger, you should treat the tiger like a cat. You've got to treat the tiger like a tiger. And that's a reality, right? You have to deal with it. So in international relations, the biggest danger in international relations is engaging in wishful thinking. Oh, how I wish Deng Xiaoping would come back, and you can't. It won't happen. It's a bigger country. And I guarantee you this, if Deng Xiaoping was leader of China today, in 2021, he will be as assertive as Xi Jinping. Because there is also Chinese public opinion, right?
Right.
And I don't understand why, Americans say that our public opinion matters. You give me the Pew surveys of what Europeans think and what Americans think. Why don't you do a Pew survey of what Chinese think? And do the Chinese support Xi Jinping's policies, or do they oppose Xi Jinping's policies? Now, there's a Harvard Kennedy School academic study, I'm sure you can trust the Harvard Kennedy School, that shows that support for the Chinese government has gone up in the last 10 years in China, right?
Right.
And why? Because the Chinese government has delivered the greatest improvement in the standard of living of the Chinese people. For the improvement in standard of living of Chinese people, the last 40 years have been the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history. The Chinese people, especially the people at the bottom, have never experienced such an improvement in the standard of living. So the Chinese people are very happy with their government, and the Chinese people support their government on the various things that the Chinese government is doing. And at the same time, even though China has become more assertive, China has not become aggressive. There's a big difference between the words assertive and aggressive. And to understand what aggressive means, read the book. I quote Professor Graham Allison, in my book.
I read his book, recent book as well.
He says in this pages 88 and 89, he says, Americans keep wishing that China would be more like us. He says, be careful what you wish for, because when America became powerful in 1890, and after Teddy Roosevelt took over Assistant Secretary of the Navy, in the decade that followed Teddy Roosevelt's arrival in Washington, D.C., the U.S. declared war on Spain, expelling it from the Western Hemisphere and acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, threatened Germany and Britain with war, and supported an insurrection in Colombia to create a new country, Panama, in order to build a canal. Come on, this is how great powers behave, right?
Right.
And let me give you a small example. If Teddy Roosevelt was running China today, the first thing he would do is take over all the islands in the South China Sea. They can just kick out Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei easily, right? So actually, in terms of how great powers behave, relatively speaking, China has been very restrained. China has not fought a war in 40 years. Now, tell me, how many wars has the United States fought in the last 20 years?
Wow.
Do you know that the United States has spent $5.1 trillion on overseas wars? The United States has dropped 175,000 bombs on several countries. The United States has killed 800,000 people in these wars. Now, just imagine if China behaved like the United States. What kind of world would we have?
To your point, statistics speaks itself, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you think we have a very benevolent giant. Actually, the tiger that we have right next door is actually something that we can live together, it sounds like. Now, let me just ask you another quite a controversial question in regards to that. We're obviously, we grew up in our generation with Western thinking, and obviously living in Korea and Japan and most of the countries in Southeast Asia as well, we live in what we call this democracy. And we think that our democracy system has well established in our territories. Now, having said that, you mentioned in your book as well about looking at Hong Kong, and this did not happen when it happened, I think, after you published the book, which is the security laws that has been passed in Hong Kong. And it's one of these small activities that the China has done, which you don't say it's aggressive, it's assertive, but it could be translated as what could come next. And that's what we are worried about. And I understand that you should not worry now. You should just be happy with China in terms of its superpower and what it does relatively, what other superpowers has done before. But those activities, don't you think we should be alarmed of what is happening in Hong Kong?
You know, you use the word benevolent. Huh?
Yeah.
China is not benevolent.
Okay.
You know why? No great power is benevolent. No great power sacrifices its own interests to benefit other countries. All great powers will put their interests first. This is true of the Roman Empire. This is true of the Tang Dynasty. This is true of the British Empire. This is true of the United States as a hegemon. Okay, all great powers put their interests first. China will not sacrifice its interest to benefit other countries. No great power does it. The only question is whether you can align your interests with a great power, then you can work with a great power, right? That's how international relations work. But I'm glad you brought up the example of Hong Kong, because I mean, the simple point here is that, you know, Hong Kong is part of China.
Right.
So just like Jeju Island is part of South Korea.
Right.
So can you imagine the Japanese coming and knocking on South Korea's door and saying, we don't like the way you treat the people in Jeju Island? And the South Korean reaction would be, excuse me, this is none of your business. Jeju Island is part of South Korea. South Korea will decide what to do with Jeju Island. In the same way, it's a mistake for the rest of the world to tell China what to do in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is part of China.
But is that really
Hong Kong was seized from China, as you know, in the Opium War.
Right.
And that's why, you see, the reason, one thing I have done, which I hope is helpful to maybe even to Koreans, I've done a 4-week MOOC course, MOOC.
Right.
And in which I do 3 lectures on China's century of humiliation. Hong Kong is a symbol of the century of humiliation that China suffered at the hands of Western powers. And frankly, China has been surprisingly generous in allowing 50 years of autonomy for Hong Kong, right? By contrast, you know, and in my book, as you know, you read my book, President John F. Kennedy and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan wrote a letter to an Anglophile Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, saying, don't invade Goa, right? Goa was a Portuguese colony in India.
Right.
What did Jawaharlal Nehru did? He sent his troops in, took away Goa, finished, settled. China can do that. China can send its troops into Hong Kong and take over Hong Kong in 24 hours, right?
Yes.
So, you know, and so it's a mistake for the West to provoke China on Hong Kong. And the biggest mistake that the West made is that when the demonstrators were peaceful, that was a good thing. Peaceful demonstrations are good, but the demonstrators became violent. I was in Hong Kong. I saw the violent demonstrators in my own eyes. And when the demonstrators attacked the Legislative Assembly, that was a mistake. And it was a mistake for the United States to praise that, for Nancy Pelosi to praise that, because as you know, when the Capitol was stormed, how did the United States react? And Nancy Pelosi got very angry. But how can Nancy Pelosi support a violent attack on the Legislative Assembly in Hong Kong and protest against a violent attack on the Capitol? The use of violence should always be condemned. And if the West was logically and morally consistent, the West should have said, we support peaceful demonstrations in Hong Kong. We condemn violent demonstrations in Hong Kong.
Right.
And so the West, you know, and here, if I make a very provocative point, the West is not interested in the well-being of the Hong Kong people. The West is interested in using Hong Kong as a propaganda weapon against China. And the Hong Kong people should not allow themselves to be used as a propaganda weapon against China. And, you know, I've written about this for 20, 30 years. That's why my first book is called Can Asians Think? ? I discuss all these issues. Categorically. If you want to help Hong Kong, let us help it intelligently and not emotionally.
I think your point you just made is very important. If the West is going to criticize on China of what they're doing, at least they should have a same standard that they apply in their domestic market, as well as they do it on China or internationally in general. I think that's very important message that you have. Having said that, let's go back to another regional issue that is important to Korea right now. It's a hot debate. It's about Quad. About the Quad.
Quad. Oh, yes.
I also read your article on South China Morning Post. You criticized on Quad as well. Korea hasn't joined, but we're definitely talking. I know our ministries or country is talking about how to handle this situation. But you mentioned how, and I don't know whether I can smartly integrate this question, but you mentioned how United States has become, for lack of better word, pompous after the Cold War, and then they don't like to, or they don't work well with partners anymore. And we were definitely be able to see that at the height when Trump came in. But isn't Quad is a manifestation of United States now recognizing that they cannot handle China alone, that they're looking for right partners, they're asking partners in the region to work together to handle or deal with China?
Well, I think I must emphasize that countries have the sovereign right to join any organization they want to. So South Korea, if it wants to join Quad, then the name will sound nicer. It'll be Squad.
Right.
You know.
Okay.
South Korea and the Quad. So, at the same time, you know, when I write about what the United States is doing, I'm actually trying to help the United States. I'm not anti-American.
Right.
I'm actually pro-American. And I'm trying to tell the Americans that the contest between US and China will not be a military contest. It will be an economic contest. And therefore, when you try to set up a military counterbalance to China, right, which is Australia, Japan, India, US, it will fail. The Quad will fail because it's playing the wrong game. The right game is the economic one. So if United States wants to actually counterbalance China, instead of joining the Quad, it should join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's the right thing to do. So I'm trying to help the United States. I'm saying, hey, if you really want to match China's influence in East Asia, forget the Quad. Join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And at the end of the day, it is the trade agreements that will determine the future of this region. So if United States keeps its military presence, but loses its economic weight in the region, it'll become a lesser and lesser player. Whereas China, by contrast, as you know, has signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, in which South Korea and Japan have also joined. And that is, as you know, I conclude my article on the Quad by saying the future of the region will be determined by RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and not by the Quad. And that's why I think it's a mistake for India not to join the RCEP. So if indeed United States wants to try and counterbalance Chinese influence in this region, it should encourage India to join the RCEP. Don't ask India to join the Quad. It's a wrong club. So I actually speak as a friend of the United States, encouraging the United States to adopt a more intelligent policy. And one of the biggest strategic mistakes that the US has made is the amount of money it has wasted in the military dimension. I mentioned earlier that the United States has spent $5 trillion fighting wars since in the last 20 years, since 9/11. Now, you know, the United States is also the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period, right? And that's created a sea of despair among the white working classes, and that's how Donald Trump was elected in America. So as a friend of America, I say, don't spend $5 trillion fighting useless wars in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, that have achieved nothing, all failures.
Right.
The United States is the only country that spends $5 trillion to achieve failures. So why not give that $5 trillion to the bottom 50% in America whose standard of living has gone down, so that they can see an improvement in their lives, and each member of the bottom 50% will get a check for $30,000. A check for $30,000 is important for Americans because today 60% of Americans don't have access to $400 in emergency cash.
Right.
I'm sure 60% of South Koreans have access to $400 in emergency cash. So how is it a very rich country like the United States has lost its way? So I want to help the United States find its way. I want to help the United States become strong again. But to become strong again, he's got to think strategically, stop wasting money on the military expenditures, and spend money to improve his economic well-being of his people.
Right. But the system got its own thinking. You talked about the system failure in the United States. Can it make a U-turn?
Well, I think that's what I'm trying to do in my book, Has China Won? Which is why, you know, the thoughtful Americans who read my book, like my book, you know. I mean, I give you an example. Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary and the former president of Harvard University, was recently interviewed on Bloomberg. And he was asked to name the 3 best books he had read in 2020. The first book he mentioned was Barack Obama's memoirs. The second book he mentioned was a book by the Nobel laureate Angus Deaton, Deaths of Despair, which speaks about the point I made. And the third book he mentioned is Kishore Mahbubani's book on Has China Won? Right. So why do Americans like my book? Americans like my book because they understand I'm trying to help America become strong again. And America has developed some structural weaknesses. And one structural weakness is that America has become a plutocracy, right? Yeah. But I'm not the only one saying America has become a plutocracy. I mean, the late Paul Volcker said so. He was a friend of mine. Martin Wolf of Financial Times says America has become plutocracy. The Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz says America has become a plutocracy. So, you know, as a friend of America, if you see your friend going in the wrong direction, do you say keep on going or do you say stop? And since South Korea is a friend of the United States, South Korea should speak as frankly to the United States as I do and help the United States become stronger again.
Well, you talk about plutocracy. A lot of people, even when in the United States, they criticize about their campaign funding structure and what the Supreme Court's decision has done in their democracy itself. Actually, that's exactly what I thought. You know, Has China Won your book? As I was reading it and I was finishing through your last page, it sounded like at the surface you were praising China and you were not saying, you know, America is no longer the great superpower, which relatively could be, but it was giving a lots of detailed roadmap of what United States needs to do in coming years to regain or stay at where it is or regain the past glory. So I thought Chinese officials actually may not like your book. They might initially praise it in the beginning, but you have definitely has provided that detailed roadmap. which I
but
think
I'll tell you why Chinese officials would like my book, because I'm asking the United States of America to work out a clear, comprehensive, long-term strategy for dealing with China.
right.
And the man who told me that the United States doesn't have a strategy is Henry Kissinger. In the book I described a one-on-one lunch I had with Henry Kissinger in March 2018, and in which Henry Kissinger told me, the problem in the United States is that it doesn't have a strategy for dealing with China. So if the United States has a thoughtful long-term strategy for dealing with China, and this is what I document in the last chapter, there are 5 non-contradictions between US and China. So the US should not see China's rise as necessarily one that will damage the United States of America. The simple question that the American strategic thinker should ask is, does China threaten America? It looks like a simple question. And the answer, most Americans say the answer is yes. But the correct answer is no. Because China is not planning to invade the United States militarily, right? China is not thinking of sending aircraft carriers 12 miles off America's shores, right? China is not thinking of exporting a Communist Party system to the United States of America, right? China is not thinking of bringing down the US economy, because actually China relies on the American market for number one market for its exports. So if you go it systematically, what China threatens is American primacy, but not the American people. So I'm telling America, what is more important, the well-being of your people or the primacy of America? So I think the well-being of the American people is more important. At a time when you have the deaths of despair rising in America, America should focus its energy on helping the American people. And I want Biden to succeed. But for the way for Biden to succeed is not to waste money engaging in a geopolitical contest against China, but to compete with China in some areas, but cooperate in other areas. And we, countries like South Korea and Singapore, should explain to United States of America that we want to be friends with America, but we also have to be friends with China. We don't want to choose one or the other.
Well, your comment sort of naturally moves into the next question I had. So basically, you said in your book, I think it was page 56, say even after Trump, leaves office, the next president will not be able to restore the trust in America that Trump has eroded. This is a quote from your book. Now Biden is in there. Do you still think that Biden cannot restore the trust, or what do you think at least he should do in order to restore that trust, at least in this region?
Well, I think, if you could, I think most people will answer by saying, can you assure me that we will have at least 8 to 12 to 16 years of a Biden-like administration? Okay. And I can tell you that the likelihood of, 4 years from now, I think Biden will be 82.
Right.
And he will probably be a single-term president. And if there is a contest between Kamala Harris,
a very provocative statement.
Yeah. And if there's a contest between Kamala Harris,
right,
Donald Trump, or a Donald Trump-like person,
right,
Donald Trump can win again in 2024. So the point is, when you say it is not, I can trust I like America as a country. I trust the American people. But if they chose another Trump government that says, I want to make America great again, I want to put America first, I want South Korea to pay me 5 times what it used to pay in the past to maintain a US base in South Korea. So is America now interested in South Korea's welfare or East Asian welfare, or only his own welfare? Right?
Right.
So that is a question you have to ask. So you got to. So I hope. By the way, I think Biden will be a very good president. I think Biden will be much more courteous and much more polite. And I think, for example, it was a tragedy that even though Donald Trump met Kim Jong-un, which is a very good thing, and I think he should be given the Nobel Peace Prize for meeting Kim Jong-un.
Especially in Singapore.
Yeah, in Singapore, yes. But his negotiators, Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, were very bad because they wanted North Korea to surrender. They didn't try to meet North Korea halfway. You give me 1 inch, I give you 1 inch. You give me 1 inch, I give you 1 inch. And that would have been a sensible thing to do, right? So at the end of the day, you have, from South Korea's point of view, you have a government that goes from one extreme to the other extreme. How do you manage this? So that's why I say the questions being asked. So we want the United States to play a role in the region. We want the United States to develop a strong bipartisan foreign policy that doesn't rotate every 4 years and goes here. And that's how you trust
important. But you're talking about or questioning the whole entire democratic system, or at least what it is used to be in the United States or even in Korea, where we're used to have a different ideology taking a helm in the government from time to time, which I think has bring that dynamism to the society could sometimes help as well. But I understand to your point that it'll be very hard to imagine consistency from America. So do you think the entire system or the institutions in America, that we see it as a beacon of hope, or that city on the hill that has failed completely?
Well, I think, during the Cold War, United States went from Republican to Democrat to Republican, and the policies remained consistent. Okay, so for example, Jimmy Carter started the fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, and Ronald Reagan continued. And Jimmy Carter is at one extreme. Reagan, there was a bipartisan consensus on what should be done in dealing with the Soviet Union, right? In the same way, United States should work out a thoughtful, long-term, credible strategy. In my book, I quote George Kennan a lot. And George Kennan, even though he's known as the father of the policy of containment, also had very thoughtful ideas on how you manage great power competition. So George Kennan disapproved of military expenditures. He said that at the end of the day, the outcome of the contest between the United States and Soviet Union will not be determined by how many bullets or bombs you have. It would depend on the spiritual vitality of the society. Which society has a stronger economy, which society has a stronger society. So it's better for United States today to cut down its defense expenditures and spend more money on improving its society and well-being. And it was Eisenhower who said, the very famous president, that every dollar that America spends on a jet fighter, on a tank, on an aircraft carrier is a dollar stolen from the poor in America, right? And that the outcome of the contest, America has 13 aircraft carriers. The 13 aircraft carriers are not assets to America, they're liabilities to America. And as you know, in my book, I say, why spend $1 billion on an aircraft carrier when it can be brought down by $100,000 hypersonic missile from China? So what is going on here? But there's a military industry complex in the United States that is driving United States towards military expenditures, which George Kennan would have disapproved of. So the contest is an economic one. So therefore, as I keep emphasizing, my arguments are intended to help the United States of America make a U-turn and adopt more credible long-term strategic policies. And then those long-term strategic policies can then develop a bipartisan consensus in the United States. But United States today has become so polarized precisely because, as George Kennan says, the society lacks spiritual vitality. It's become very, very divided. And a divided America is not good for South Korea, not good for Singapore. So we should help America heal itself and become stronger again.
Okay. Well, we talked about United States and China a lot, and actually sometimes, I don't know about you, but sometimes I get a little bit tired whenever I open up my foreign affairs, continuously only talk about China and the United States, because the world is not just about United States and China. But anyways, going back to our peninsula, you talked about the divided society. Well, we have divided country, as you know.
Yes.
And North Korea obviously has the conversation that you mentioned about Trump and Kim Jong-un in Singapore. It didn't come to what we had expected. We could not come to agreement, and yet today's situation actually could be even worse than what it was before. Moving forward, as a career diplomat who's been in there for 30 years, great thinker and strategist, what kind of advice would you have in South Korea or even to the United States and China about North Korea dealing, and especially about the nuclear issues?
Well, I mean, the international relations, principles of international relations go back to 2,000, 3,000 years. Okay? So let me give you a simple example. Diplomacy was invented 2,000 years ago because in the old days, when an ambassador went to an enemy capital and he spoke to the king and he said something that the king didn't like, the king would cut off his head. That used to happen to ambassadors.
Right.
So then they thought about it. They said, this is stupid, because if I cut off the head of the ambassador, I cannot talk to anybody.
Right.
So the concept of diplomatic immunity was invented. So diplomatic immunity means that the purpose of diplomacy is not to talk to your friends, because friends don't cut off your heads.
Right.
The purpose of diplomacy is to talk to your enemies. Now, so United States has misunderstood what diplomacy is all about. United States wants to establish diplomatic relations only with friends, not with enemies. That's a complete misunderstanding of why diplomacy came about. So, for example, if North Korea is an enemy of the United States, the first thing the United States should do is establish diplomatic relations with North Korea so we can talk to North Korea, right? And this is something that's common sense. So, I don't understand why United States has got the best universities in the world. It spends billions of dollars on strategic think tanks, but it doesn't have strategic common sense. So the first step, I would say, you cannot wish away North Korea, right? North Korea has now been around since 1953, at least, right?
Right. Well, that's the end of Korean War, so it's before that even.
Yeah, even before that. So North Korea is not going to go away. Now, the first principle of realism is that if it is going to be around, you got to talk to them. So number one principle, talk to North Korea, establish diplomatic relations in North Korea. Number two, that if you have to, the biggest strategic decision the United States has to make is that does the United States want to go for regime change or behavior change? As you know, United States policy has been oscillating towards North Korea. Right. Sometimes behavior change, sometimes regime change. And when the United States signed the agreement on KEDO, right? United States didn't follow through that agreement. And in some memoirs written by American officials, they say they signed the agreement on KEDO in the belief that the North Korean regime would collapse. And, but that is dishonest. That's dishonorable. So I think it is in South Korea's interest to encourage United States to adopt intelligent, thoughtful, long-term strategic policies towards North Korea. And don't have this crazy situation where President Trump speaks to the North Korean leader, which is a good thing, And then Mike Pompeo and John Bolton insist on the North Korean surrender, which is a bad thing.
Right.
It doesn't make sense, you know. And so since South Korea has the biggest interest in stabilizing the situation in the Korean Peninsula, South Korea should make an effort to educate Washington, D.C. on how to deal with North Korea. And South Korea should advocate that the United States should establish diplomatic relations with North Korea. Because at the end of the day, I was a diplomat for 33 years, you know. And the best way to persuade people is to talk to people face to face. Okay? And I'll give you a concrete example so you understand my point. You know, in the Cold War, after the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, Vietnam, by the way, is a communist-run country, okay?
Right.
Vietnam and Singapore fought each other, right? In the Cold War. I used to have very fierce debating matches, me against the Vietnamese ambassador in 1984, 85, 86, 87, 88. I used to debate the Vietnamese. The Cold War ended, right?
Right.
And then Vietnam lost the Soviet Union. Soviet Union collapsed. So Vietnam, as you know, joined ASEAN, right? And you know who was Vietnam's best friend in ASEAN?
It was you.
Singapore. So how is it? We were arguing, right? Within 6 years, we became good friends. And Singapore set up an industrial park in Vietnam. Why? Because we were talking to each other all the time, right? And so why doesn't, just imagine if North Korea and South Korea, you know, North Korea is communist, South Korea is non-communist, Vietnam is communist, Singapore is non-communist. You know, we have a very good relationship. No.
Well, although someone would argue that North Korea is not really a communist, it's more of a, it's more of a, you know, it's an ancient regime of very dictatorship-driven country. But anyways, I think what you've just said about North Korea and what South Korea and the United States should do, the recommendation is something that current administration, at least Korean administration, would like, or actually has pursued over the past 3-4 years, and which was a part of the reasons why the meeting in Singapore between Trump and Kim Jong-un happened. Okay, having said that, now we're going into the final minutes of our conversation, right? How long have we done it?
7 minutes left.
7 minutes left, they say.
Sure.
So let's just go back, talk about the future a little bit. You talked about how things are shifting from the West and East, and a lot of people are talking about it, and numbers shows, the statistics shows, the events show.
But I was the first to say it 30 years ago.
Well, credit all to
I did
you.
it 30 years ago in my book.
30 years ago.
Yeah.
Which book did you do that to?
No, there was an essay I published
Right.
in National Interest called The West and the Rest.
Okay, West and the
In
Rest.
1982 or 83, yeah.
I don't know how many people would have believed that at the time, but
1992, 1993, yeah.
well, what sure
30
has
years ago.
happened, it's happening. But we are facing our own challenges. You know, China, rising China, and as we have talked about it extensively today, what it means for us, what it means for all the countries and members in this region. I mean, it's such a dynamic and diverse region. You know, West try to call us nations, but it's actually very, very dynamic and diverse in terms of ethnicity, the religions, cultures, and whatnot. But do you think there is what we call an Asian value that sort of connects all together? Or do we even need one? But to prepare ourselves in coming centuries, as you've mentioned, what we need to think about, how we need to prepare for the future.
Well, I think there are no universal Asian values among all Asian societies, by the way. We are very different. We are very, very diverse. And just look at me. I'm Indian, right? So I don't subscribe to the Confucian ethics of China, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and so on and so forth.
Although you have many Chinese friends.
Yes, but I'm not Chinese.
Speak fluently in Chinese.
So, but the point I want to make to you is that the one ray of hope in Asia is ASEAN. And I wish South Koreans would understand ASEAN and the ASEAN miracle even more. People don't realize that the most successful regional organization in the world in some ways is ASEAN, because ASEAN, out of 650 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, and then you have Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and even communists in Vietnam. So it is the most diverse region of planet Earth. In theory, the Christians and Muslims and Buddhists should be fighting each other, right?
Right.
Why is there peace in ASEAN? Why? So I tell you, this is because Indonesia as a country, and I document this in my book, ASEAN Miracle, has injected the culture of mushawara and mufakat. Please understand those words, consultation and consensus. So this is what we should teach Americans to do. Don't come and bang the table and say, you're with us or against us, you're with us, or you must do what I say. No. Have consultation and consensus. And so the reason why East Asia is the fastest growing region in the world, the reason why you have the RCEP, the RCEP only happened because ASEAN signed free trade agreements with China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India. Right? As you know, and let me put this very bluntly, if China, Japan, South Korea, 3 countries sat down in a room and tried to negotiate a free trade agreement, they would fail. Because there's distrust within South Korea and Japan, distrust within Japan and China, distrust within China and South Korea. But you know what? Because ASEAN created an umbrella, right? RCEP. Under the ASEAN umbrella, China, Japan, and South Korea signed a free trade agreement. So the 3 countries should thank ASEAN. We gave you the opportunity to sign a free trade agreement among yourselves. On your own, you could never have done so. Let's be honest about it. So don't you think you deserve to thank ASEAN for that?
Well,
right?
We think ASEAN is a great partner.
No, but you see, you must do more than that. You must thank ASEAN publicly. The 3 countries, China, Japan, South Korea, should come together and write a letter of thanks signed by China, Japan, South Korea and say, thank you, ASEAN. Because of you, we managed to get a free trade agreement among ourselves. Otherwise, we would never have succeeded.
Well, you yourself said 3 countries getting together, signing a thanking letter, co-signing it would be very difficult negotiation, don't you think?
Yeah, but that proves my point. It proves my point that ASEAN is a remarkable organization. So, if you read the Anglo-Saxon media, they will always emphasize the differences in East Asia, and there are many, many differences, which is why I have personally launched something called the Asian Peace Program at the Asia Research Institute. You can Google it, Google Asian Peace Program. And you see, I even wrote articles about the Korean Peninsula and all that. So it's important, therefore, for South Korea to not be caught in the Western mindset. And South Korea, for example, must understand ASEAN and work with ASEAN and then use ASEAN as a way of restraining Japan and restraining China.
Well, talking about ASEAN, are you worried about what's happening in Burma?
Very worried. Very worried. But, the solution is not to impose sanctions. The solution is to have a dialogue with the military regime and tell them this is not going to work. The era of military regimes is over, right? But
Right.
the way you do it is by talking to them and dealing with them, not by imposing sanctions on them.
Right.
And if you can get all the countries in this region to come together and send a joint message. So you know what? South Korea, Japan, China, India, ASEAN should all come together and collectively send a message to the military regime and say, this is not going to work. It is not going to succeed. And you got to go back.
Well, I hope that all the leaders in this region, as well as Biden, and of course the military regime in Burma, is listening to what you said this morning.
Yes.
I'm sure they are. Okay, I think we're getting towards the end of our conversation. You talked about in this book, which caught my eyes, was towards the end of your book, said, with all these systems and institutions and history that we talk about, personalities do matter, right? And it's at the end of the day, who's sitting across the table really matters when it comes to negotiations, having a conversation. Well, definitely very pleasant to have you at the other end of the table. But hopefully the Biden's new administration will be able to sit down with China together and have something to resolve peacefully and cooperatively rather than creating more conflict. It seems like Biden is trying to do that by at least talking about climate space, right? Any final words would you have for the Korean audience?
I think we should all help Biden succeed. Because if Biden fails, another Trump or Trump-like figure will come back, and a Trump-like figure a second Trump-like figure will be even more disruptive than a Trump 2.0 will be more disruptive than a Trump 1.0. So we should help Biden succeed. But the only way to help Biden succeed is to speak to him frankly and to say, don't try to increase your military presence in East Asia. That is not what the region needs. The region needs your economic presence in East Asia. Please come back and join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Please come back and engage in economic exchanges with the region. And for the time being, press the pause button on the trade war with China and try to, in a sense, work together with China to kill COVID-19. Because once COVID-19 is killed, the US economy will bounce back up. And if the US economy bounces back up, then Biden or a Democrat can be re-elected again. So we should give him strong, sensible advice to the Biden administration.
Great. Thank you. On that note, we're going to say goodbye this morning. Hopefully able to see you in person sometime in the near future.
Thank you. I really appreciated this conversation, and I hope you didn't mind that I was very frank in my responses.
No, I think Korean audience would definitely appreciate your frankness.